On October 1, 1993, 12-year-old Polly Claus from Petaluma, California, invited two of her friends over for a sleepover. The evening was going great until the girl's mother awoke to intense screaming and discovered that her daughter had been kidnapped by an unknown man. Polly Hannah Claus was born on January 3, 1981 in Fairfax, California, USA. Polly's family consisted of her father, Mark, mother, Eva, and younger sister, Annie. Her parents separated when she was very young, and as a result of this separation, the girls went to live with their mother in the city of Petaluma, California. Mark, for his part, had a new relationship after the separation, and Polly got along very well with this woman. Overall, there was a very good family dynamic, and the girl spent time with both her mother and father, and there were no problems between them. Polly is described as a fairly quiet and innocent child. She had a few friends but was generally very shy. Something she really enjoyed doing and where she felt very confident was theater. Polly participated in various school plays, she enjoyed acting, and she also participated in several musicals organized by her community. In many of these plays she played the lead role, and her main dream was to become a very good actress in musical theater. In addition to that, Polly loved sleepovers. She loved having friends over to her house for sleepovers, and she also loved going to sleepovers with her friends. They had a great time, and it was an activity that her group of friends did regularly. So on October 1, 1993, when Polly asked her mother for permission to have two friends over for a sleepover, she did not refuse her. The two friends were named Jillian and Kate. The two girls arrived at Polly's house that afternoon, had dinner there, and the first few hours of the evening went quite well. At 9:45 p.m. Polly's mother decided to go to bed, as she had a bad headache. So she told the girls she was going to bed and asked them to wake her if they needed anything. According to Eva, she took 2 sleeping pills and fell into a deep sleep. After 11 p.m., she was awakened by the screams of her daughter's friends. Both girls told her that a man had broken into the house and taken Polly away. Eva apparently called the police at this point and went to see if her other daughter, Annie, was okay. The girl was in her room and didn't seem to notice anything. When the police arrived, they began questioning Polly's two friends. The girls said they were in a room playing and figuring out what costume to wear for Halloween and doing all sorts of nonsense. At about 11 p.m., Polly said it was time to go to bed, and her friends agreed. She said she would go and get the inflatable bed she had made with her mom so the three of them could sleep together. When Polly opened the door of her room, there was a man standing in front of them, and they saw that he had a knife in his hand, and the man was not wearing a mask. Since Halloween was approaching, the girls thought it was some kind of joke and started laughing. But then they realized that it wasn't. The man got very angry when they laughed, forced them into a room, and tied their hands and feet. He asked who lived in the house, and all three of them said it was Polly. Then the man took the pillowcases off the pillows and put them over Jillian and Kate's heads, and then told them that they must count to 1,000 and that he would take Polly away for a moment, but then bring her back. When the girls saw that the man had already left, they tried to free themselves. For about half an hour they tried to get out, until at last they were able to do so. And when they got out of the room, they went straight to Eva to tell her that her daughter was missing and that a man had taken her away. They told all this to the police and also gave a very thin description of the man. Let me remind you that he wasn't wearing a mask, he wasn't covering his face, so Jillian and Kate could see him perfectly, which allowed the officers to draw up a sketch of the man to start looking for him. There wasn't much evidence at Polly's house. A few footprints were found, but they all belonged to Polly, her mother, her sister, and other family friends who had been in the house the previous days. Some fibers were found on the carpet, and they were significantly different from the carpet in Polly's house. They were taken for analysis and determined that they belonged to the carpet of the car. The police analyzed the cars of people who were in the house and were known to the family and found no matches. Therefore, the assumption was made that the fibers belonged to the kidnapper's vehicle. A palm print was also found. At that time, there was not yet so much progress in the field of fingerprinting, DNA, and everything else, so it was not possible to compare it with any database. But nevertheless, the print was preserved so that it could be compared to the suspect found at a later date. Another item found in Polly's room was a piece of fabric that looked very much like silk and looked like it had been cut with scissors from a garment. It had a very specific pattern, and the police concluded that this could also help them in the future. There was also a hair that was found that was unknown to whom it belonged because, as I said, DNA and all these techniques, although they already existed, were not developed enough to be analyzed. The search for Polly became one of the largest searches conducted in the United States up to that time. Many people joined in as volunteers. A total of 4,000 people searched for the girl in the neighborhoods around her home, in vacant lots, and in large estates near the location. Police tried to find drivers who resembled the sketch, but these attempts were unsuccessful. Officers wanted to find Polly within 24 hours of her disappearance because after that time it would have been very difficult to find her alive. So the investigation was handed over to the FBI, and they also started active efforts to find the girl as soon as possible. But the first day passed, then another, and every day the hope of finding Polly alive disappeared. Police asked if neighbors had seen anything unusual the night of the abduction, at which point several neighbors said they did see a very strange man wandering around the neighborhood. It didn't seem unusual to them, although he did look very strange. But they had no idea that he could kidnap a girl from a neighbor's house. That's why they didn't call the emergency services. When the police showed the neighbors a sketch drawn up from the description of Polly's friends, they all agreed that they had seen the man. Officers also interviewed all the teachers and staff at the school where the girl attended. They wanted to find out if they knew the man, if any of them were related to him, or if anyone knew what had happened to little Polly, but no one knew anything. Everyone had an alibi for the time of the events and none of the school staff fit the description, nor did they look like the sketch that had been made. The police went so far as to compare the fiber found in Polly's house to the car mats of teachers' cars and all school staff, but none of them came back positive. As I said, as the days went on, the desperation of not only the family, but also the authorities and the general population grew. Everyone feared that this man who was kidnapping children was a danger to society, and this obviously put even more pressure on the police to solve the case. A reward of $200,000 was put up for providing truthful information that could help the police locate Polly. This money was sponsored by actress Winona Ryder, who even held a press conference asking for Polly's return. The Polly case had another peculiarity. In 1993, the internet was not so developed, and neither the police nor the FBI were used to the fact that you could search for a person via the internet or distribute leaflets on it. So 3 people from California decided to do it on their own. They posted a picture of Polly, a sketch of the man who had kidnapped her, and a reward ad for any clue. All of this began to spread on the internet. There was no social media at the time, but there were other forms of communication, and eventually, 25 million people in the US are believed to have seen Polly's picture via the internet. FBI investigators thought this would be a very important tool in the investigation, but unfortunately, it turned out not to be. Despite the fact that the disappearance was gaining more and more publicity, no leads could be obtained from internet users. However, this led to a lot of people volunteering, phone centers being set up with hundreds of tips per day, and even hope for the families of other missing children who wanted to contact the Claus family, help them find Polly, and possibly do the same for their children. The investigators were beginning to feel very frustrated. It had been weeks since Polly had been kidnapped and they had no leads. They didn't know who the man who had kidnapped her was and obviously couldn't get a DNA match. In fact, they couldn't even get DNA from hair or a palm print, which made them feel even more helpless. In this helplessness, they got a phone call, or rather they called Polly's father, Mark. On the other end of the wire, he heard a girl's voice, very similar to his daughter's, who told him that she was at the hotel and that the man who had kidnapped her had left her there for a minute. And that was why she had been able to contact him. The girl claimed to be Polly and then hung up. Mark immediately went to the police to tell them what was happening. The FBI officers at the time also didn't have such a sophisticated tool to trace a call that had already been made, so they just sat back and waited for a new call, hoping to trace it. The second call came a few hours after the first. It was the same girl who had spoken to Mark. After receiving this call, the police were able to trace it, but they found it very strange that it led them not to a hotel, as the girl had said, but to a residential neighborhood. When officers arrived, they knocked on the house where the call had been made from and realized at that moment that it was a prank. A teenage girl the same age as Polly lived in the house, so the voice was very similar. She said that her friends challenged her. She was not fined or taken to the police station, but simply asked the parents to control their daughter's actions and asked her not to joke about such a serious subject anymore. On November 28, 1993, almost 2 months after Polly's disappearance, the police received a call from a woman. She reported that she had found 3 suspicious objects on a several-acre plot of land she owned. Police, who arrived on the scene with the FBI, found 3 items very important to the investigation. They found a piece of silk identical to the one in Polly's room, a pair of ballet tights that Eva said were missing from the house that night, and, in addition, duct tape. The police began to speculate that Polly was in the area, at which point the FBI learned something new. Sometime before the discovery of all these things, namely on the day of Polly's disappearance, the same woman went to the police with a report. Strangers had been frequenting her property. Many of them didn't even know they were trespassers. She had too much land and it was wooded, with only a small house inside. She didn't have a fence all around the property. Although there were signs that it was private property, but without a fence or anything to prevent trespassing, stray people often passed through the place without realizing they were on private property. The woman had many intruders, but one she remembered in particular. On the night of Polly's abduction, this man had snuck up to her house in his automobile. The car got stuck in the mud. The nanny who was looking after the woman's son was the first to see the man, but did not approach him because, she said, she was too frightened. The owner of the house did not approach the man either. She thought he had a look of anger in his eyes. Then they decided to call the police. The officers arrived and started asking the man what he was doing there. He said he didn't realize he was on private property and that he would leave quickly, but asked the officers to help him pull his car out of the mud. The officers saw that the man was very nervous, scared, sweating, and on top of that, it appeared that he was drugged. At the time, they had no way to administer a drug test, and because he was not assaulting them, they could not arrest him. So the officers helped him out of the mud and he eventually drove away. This man's name was Richard Allen Davis. He was born in 1954 in San Francisco, California. His childhood was marred by the violence that his parents used on him. When he was 12 years old, his parents separated. His mother disowned him completely, stating that she wanted nothing to do with her son and left him to his father. Richard's father was a very irresponsible man. He would leave the house for hours and often days, and Richard was often left alone, sometimes with neighbors, and sometimes he would seek out some of his relatives. Already in his teens, his criminal history began. Richard started stealing, got into street fights, and spent several months in reform school. At the age of 17, he committed a violent robbery, nearly killing the man he robbed. So the judge gave him two options. He could either go to reform school or join the U.S. Army. Richard chose to join the Army, but he did not serve for 2 years and was dishonorably discharged for his terrible behavior. As he matured, Richard continued to have problems and his criminal record became much longer. At about age 20, he was sentenced to 15 years for robbery and kidnapping. He only served 1 year of those 15 years, as he was paroled for good behavior. At the time, Richard was haunted by another charge. Many of his friends believed that he had killed a 19-year-old girl named Marlene, even though the police recognized that she had left on her own. But in the young woman's entourage, everyone believed Richard had killed her the night they were at the party. But there was no way to prove any of this. They were just rumors. At the time of Polly's disappearance, Richard was on probation, and it was unclear where he lived at the time, as he had no specific address. The police issued a special leaflet, which they sent out to officers only, and asked them to exercise extreme caution. No information was given to the media because they were very afraid that Richard would leave California or even leave the United States. Eventually, on November 13, 1993, the man was arrested. He was driving under the influence of alcohol and a police officer pulled him over. A breathalyzer test was administered, which he failed. When the police officer saw his name and picture and looked closely at the man, he realized that this was the same man they were looking for in the Polly Claus kidnapping case. The policeman was very careful and told him that he was arresting him for violating his probation by driving drunk. Richard agreed to this and was taken to the police station. Once at the police station, they began reading him his driver's license and informed him that he was actually being held for kidnapping Polly Claus. Richard was taken to give a statement. The interrogation was quite thorough, but in the end he admitted that he had indeed kidnapped the girl. The police believe that Richard confessed under duress. Evidence was taken from his palm print, which completely matched the print found in Polly's house. The fibers found in the carpet were identical to the fibers in the carpet of his car. Polly's friends were taken to the police station for an inquest, and the girls immediately stated that the man who had kidnapped Polly was Richard. In addition, another piece of silk identical to the one found in the girl's room was found in his car, as well as on the property of the woman who had called the police. Everything was against him, and he finally decided to confess. He said that he had been using illegal substances with friends that day and was not feeling well. He decided to break into a house in a certain neighborhood to commit a burglary. Richard drove around for a while and arrived in Polly's neighborhood. He saw that there was an open window in the house and decided to climb in. The man said he didn't plan anything, never saw Polly, never saw her family or followed them. He went into the house, looked for valuables, saw there weren't many, and as he was about to leave, Polly opened the bedroom door and saw him. Richard noticed that the girl was very scared and finally decided to take one of them. According to him, he put Polly in his car, started driving, and after a while stopped in a vacant lot. There he violated Polly. After that, he got behind the wheel again. When the woman and the babysitter saw Richard on private property, he had Polly in the back seat of the car, and when police officers helped him pull the car out of the mud, Polly was still alive. This caused much frustration to the police officers, who thought her life could have been saved. After they helped him pull the car out, he drove down the highway, strangled Polly, dug a grave and left her body there. Richard told the police the exact location of the grave, and the police began a search. On December 4, 1993, 2 months and 3 days after the kidnapping, Polly Claw's body was found on the side of the highway in a grave dug by Richard himself. Forensic examination could not determine much. It was only determined that the cause of death was strangulation, just as Richard had said. However, more could not be determined. The day of death corresponds roughly to the day she disappeared. With all this evidence, the man stood trial charged with the kidnapping, murder, and rape of Polly Claus. At the trial, Richard was given the opportunity to say a few words. In addition to apologizing to the family, he also accused Polly's father of sexually abusing her. He stated that the girl said the following phrase to him, "Don't do to me what my father does to me." Polly's father yelled at Richard and was about to stand up to hit him, but did not do so because several people present at the trial restrained him. Everyone was disturbed by the words of the accused, not only because he said such a thing and didn't apologize, but also because they didn't think Polly's father had abused her, even though it hadn't been proven, and even defended her former partner. On June 18, 1996, Richard was found guilty of the kidnapping and murder of Polly Claus. In August, he was sentenced to death. He tried to challenge the death sentence but was unable to do so. In 2006, he was found unconscious in his cell after overdosing on pills, but was resuscitated and sent back to prison. In 2009, his lawyer tried to have his conviction appealed to the Supreme Court, but was unsuccessful. The Supreme Court affirmed that he should be executed. Richard's attorney stated that he would file further appeals. Because of all the appeals filed by the attorney, this man has been on death row for years and has not yet been executed. But it is hoped that in the next few years after the appeals are over, he will still be executed.
82-year-old Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill, a lonely widow, lived in a small apartment on Military Road, the main street of Mosman, a suburb of Sydney. On March 1, 1989, around noon, she left her apartment to go to local shops. After spending a few hours shopping, Gwendolyn was happily walking home. Although she had bought almost nothing, the elderly woman was in good spirits. It was around 4:00 p.m. when Gwendolyn approached the front door of her own apartment. It was at this moment that she was brutally attacked. Several boys, who were staying with a family in the apartment building where Mitchell Hill lived, were about to go home when they stumbled upon a body lying in a pool of blood. Gwendolyn was barely alive and visibly shaking. The boys recognized the sweet old lady who always treated them with candies and cookies whenever she met them in the entrance or on the street, and now she obviously needed help. Not knowing what to do, the schoolboys rushed back upstairs to the apartment they had left a couple of minutes ago and told the owners that their elderly neighbor had fallen and hit her head. 2 adult women, along with the teenagers, immediately went down a couple of floors to help Gwendolyn get up. But the elderly lady was so seriously injured that she was completely disoriented. She had no idea what was going on and did not recognize any of those present. The woman thought that the attacker had returned to finish his dirty work, so she tried to fight off her rescuers. The neighbors realized that this was clearly not just a fall and called the police. Officers who arrived at the scene found that Mitchell Hill's open handbag was lying next to her body. A significant amount of cash had been taken from it. The police also noticed that the victim's underwear and stockings had been removed, but there were no signs of any intimate violence. The victim was immediately taken to the hospital. Unfortunately, Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill did not survive the attack and died that same night. The autopsy confirmed the neighbor's grim guess. Gwendolyn had not simply fallen and hit her head. The pathologist found a lacerated wound on the back of the skull, as well as a midline fracture. Even assuming that the woman had actually fallen, it would have been a very rare fall, simply backward, without any attempt to change the position of the body or turn the head. Because of this, the pathologist believed that she had been hit on the back of the head with a blunt, heavy object. Unfortunately, the attack on Gwendolyn turned out to be too difficult a crime for the police. Despite the fact that she lived on a busy central street of the city, right opposite an active construction site, there were no witnesses to the attack. No one saw or heard anything. In addition, the neighbors who lived in the apartment building of Mitchell Hill did a good deed and washed the staircase from blood, considering everything an accident. So the police had no forensic evidence, no witness statements, and no leads as to what had happened to the elderly lady. And 2 months later, the criminal struck again. On May 9, 1989, Lady Winifreda Ashton, widow of the Anglo-Austrian Impressionist artist Sir John William Ashton, wrapped up her club after a bingo game lunch and was walking home along Military Road to the next street. On the way, the woman looked into a couple of stores and was already ready to go upstairs home when she was attacked right in the lobby of the apartment building. The criminal repeatedly hit the woman with something like a hammer. Then, when she fell, he dragged the body into a small niche where a trash can stood and hit her head several more times on the concrete floor. Police found Winifreda Ashton lying face down next to the trash can. Her bare legs were crossed and her arms outstretched at her sides. She was wearing a red raincoat. Her cane and shoes were neatly folded next to the body. Her underwear and stockings had been removed. In fact, Ashton's death was not the result of blows with a heavy object, but of strangulation with her own stockings. They were pulled so tightly around her neck that they cut into her skin. The elderly lady's entire face was bruised, and a thin trickle of blood flowed from her mouth. Her purse was missing, but a noticeable diamond ring was worn on one of her fingers. The motive of robbery was immediately questioned. It was unlikely that the thief would leave the jewelry, encroaching only on the purse. Apparently, he was pursuing another goal. The ubiquitous reporters immediately linked the violent death of Lady Winifreda Ashton to the recent death of another elderly woman, Gwendolyn Mitchell Hill, and notified the whole city that a maniac was operating, attacking affluent elderly ladies. Despite the fact that there were still no real clues, the police had to start a large-scale investigation. The problem was that they were looking for a needle in a haystack. Law enforcement officers inspected more than 2,000 homes in Mosman in an attempt to find at least something, searching a huge area. The result of these unsuccessful attempts was only a description of an unremarkable man who aroused suspicion among local residents. According to several witnesses, he was an unkempt man with disheveled hair and rotten teeth. His appearance was very repulsive, so it was remembered by several eyewitnesses. But could this homeless-looking passerby have anything to do with the crimes? At the moment, it was not possible to find out. The similarity of the situation between the sudden death of the two elderly women was also in the fact that the zealous neighbors cleaned up the crime scene. And in the fact that the zealous neighbors cleaned up the crime scene, destroying all possible evidence. The detectives, frankly not understanding where to look for the perpetrator, turned to a forensic psychiatrist with a request to compile a psychological profile of the attacker. The expert's conclusion presented the police with the following psychological and behavioral profile. It could be a young or middle-aged man who lived in the Military Road area. It is possible that he had a military background. Most likely in his life there were some special relationships with an important woman for him, which influenced his psyche. The expert did not exclude the possibility that the perpetrator could also be a high school student or a college student, since there were several educational institutions nearby in this area. In addition, both crimes occurred during the daytime. The police talked to the management of nearby schools and took note of all suspicious teenagers. About a month after the incident, a passerby found Winifreda's empty wallet in Ashton Park, named after the deceased husband of the second victim. The police searched the entire parked area but found nothing else there. A few months later, on October 18, 1989, 86-year-old Doris Cox was on her way to her retirement village. This is what places in Australia are called where elderly people who have reached a certain age spend their old age. It is a community of retirees united by common interests. They lead a fairly active lifestyle, hold joint events, and socialize. In retirement villages, there are social workers who look after elderly patients and help them in everyday life. It was in such a place that Doris Cox, who had lost her husband, lived. Her path lay along a secluded staircase in front of her house, surrounded by a brick fence. The elderly lady did not expect anything bad because she was in a familiar place where there were plenty of her friends. It was there that the perpetrator caught up with her, grabbing her from behind by the hair and hitting her head against the brickwork. Doris fell to the ground and lost consciousness. When the residents of the village found the woman, she was urgently taken to the hospital. She survived. However, the well-meaning neighbors washed away the traces of blood on the rocky path. Not wanting to leave the hospital, Doris recalled the unpleasant incident. And again, by the irony of fate, all possible forensic evidence from the crime scene was erased.
It was only the next day after the incident that doctors suspected that Doris had not just hit her head, losing her balance. That is why they called the police sergeant who was working on the 2 previous cases involving attacks on elderly ladies. One of the main investigators in the case, as soon as he was called and informed about Doris Cox, rushed to the hospital, well aware that a real clue had finally appeared. After the neighbors washed away the evidence from the crime scene and casual passers-by did not notice anything suspicious, it was a real stroke of luck. After all, the victim could remember and describe the appearance of the perpetrator. However, as it turned out, his joy was premature. Unfortunately, Doris Cox suffered from senile dementia, so she could not help the police. In fact, she had no idea what had happened to her or how she ended up in the hospital at all. Despite all the efforts of the police, it was not possible to find out anything new about the criminal. But this time, the public showed vigilance. Several people came to the police with a statement. They drew attention to a young guy riding a skateboard near the retirement village at about the same time when the attack on Doris Cox occurred. Thanks to the descriptions of several witnesses, a composite sketch of the alleged criminal was compiled and published in the mass media. Over the next few weeks, police tried unsuccessfully to track down this guy, responding to numerous reports from citizens. On November 2nd, at about 10 kilometers from Mossman, 78-year-old Dorothy Bank was returning home from shopping along a quiet, deserted street when she was approached by a stranger. The man seemed very polite and friendly to the pensioner. He offered to help the woman carry the groceries home. She agreed. Wanting to somehow thank the kind person, Dorothy invited him to stay and have a cup of tea, but the man refused. But just a few minutes later, walking along the same deaf alley, this man came across Margaret Pahut, an 85-year-old widow, slowly stepping towards the house. The stranger turned around and followed her. Choosing a secluded place where the lane was overgrown with bushes and trees, the man brutally attacked Margaret from behind, hitting her on the head with something heavy. He carefully took off the woman's underwear and stockings and put the cane and shoes next to the body. Again, there were no witnesses nearby. No one saw how it happened and did not hear any suspicious sounds or blows. Margaret lay right in the middle of the street in a pool of her own blood until a schoolgirl returning after classes noticed a pile of rags lying in the middle of the road. The girl came closer and immediately recoiled in horror. She ran home to her apartment and told her mother about the terrible incident. The woman, who had heard about the attacks on grandmothers, immediately called the police and an ambulance. When she approached the victim, she was barely breathing. Margaret died in the ambulance. This time, the evidence from the crime scene was destroyed by the untimely rain. The autopsy showed that Margaret Pahut's death was caused by severe head injuries inflicted by an unknown object. Again, no wallet was found on her. Everything coincided with the cases of the previous victims, as well as the fact that there were no witnesses to the incident nearby. This time, neither the homeless man nor the young man with the skateboard were seen. The investigation was stalled in one place, and the number of victims was steadily growing. Along with this, the detectives were under tremendous pressure from the police department, the media, and the public. They had to solve this case before the criminal struck again, and another elderly lady was hurt. The media dubbed the criminal the grandmother exterminator. Panic was growing in the city. Women were afraid to go out on the city streets. The most terrible thing was that the maniac attacked lonely old women who did not have relatives or family nearby, and they were forced to go shopping and to the pharmacy on their own. Despite the fact that the police worked around the clock on this case and occasionally taking a short break for sleep, the next crime did not take long to happen. On November 3rd in the afternoon, 81-year-old Olive Cleveland was sitting on a bench near the retirement village in Belrose, another suburb of Sydney. The elderly lady was just enjoying the view of the surroundings and breathing fresh air when an unknown man sat down on the bench next to her. He tried to strike up a conversation, but Olive, who had heard about the attacks, felt an unpleasant chill down her spine at the sight of a stranger. She felt uncomfortable, so the elderly lady quietly got up and walked towards the main building of the village. The strange interlocutor soon caught up with the woman, quietly coming up from behind. He forced her to go down the ramp into a secluded side alley, where he hit her several times on the back of the head with a heavy object before taking off her stockings and tightly tying them around her neck. The tension was so strong that the material of the stockings got stuck in the woman's neck, cutting the skin. Then the attacker rummaged through Cleveland's handbag, took out $60 from there, and neatly put the handbag, shoes, and cane next to the body. When the staff of the retirement village found the lifeless body, they decided that the woman had awkwardly fallen and tied the stockings around her neck instead of a scarf. Placing the remains in a small morgue on the territory of the village, they washed away the blood remaining on the ground with water from a hose. As soon as the detectives received information about another death of an elderly woman, they were completely disappointed. The police officers sincerely did not understand how it was possible to clear the crime scene when from every TV set and from the front pages of newspapers, they talked about the terrible attacks. Instead of paying attention to the victim and the state in which she was found, the workers of the village simply put things in order on their territory. Meanwhile, criminologists tried to identify a pattern in all 4 crimes and understand the mindset of the attacker. The use of the victim's stockings as a murder weapon clearly hinted at the need of the perpetrator to humiliate the victim in an intimate way. The use of excessive force at the same time indicated that there was something personal in the incidents and some dissatisfaction. That is, the process itself clearly caused some hidden desires in the criminal, but the fact that the victims were not subjected to sexual intercourse obliged the killer to do everything neatly, which is typical for people who had something to do with military training. This is how the psychiatrist explained the actions of the old lady exterminator. The next day, November 4th, an official task force was set up to investigate particularly serious crimes. The team included 70 people, including investigators, district detectives, intelligence officers, computer analysis experts, and forensic experts. Some members of the task force worked 20 hours a day. The state government offered a $200,000 reward for any information that could lead to the solution of this complex case. Police held public meetings where they instructed older citizens on personal safety issues. Undercover officers posed as gardeners and workers in retirement villages. Patrols on city streets were stepped up. Due to the wide coverage of this case in the media, hundreds of concerned citizens called the police and expressed their own assumptions. Officers checked almost every call, but nothing concrete was found out. And even the enhanced security measures did not stop the criminal. On November 23rd, he struck again. 93-year-old widow Muriel Falconer had lived alone for the last 39 years in her large house in Mosman. This independent woman, despite her advanced age, was completely self-confident. She could easily not lock the front door at night, as she was convinced that if a burglar needed to get inside, he would do it. And so she would just give him the money, and that's it. Who needs to get rid of a half-blind and deaf old woman? Morel believed. Her neighbor Maggie has repeatedly tried to convince the elderly lady to be careful, but she just waved her off like an annoying fly. On November 23rd, Muriel took a walk to the local store. She was tired of sitting alone within four walls. A trip to the grocery store was a kind of entertainment for her, where the pensioner could exchange a couple of phrases with the salespeople, chat with one of the neighbors, and just stretch her legs. The woman returned home around 5 o'clock in the evening. She had already unlocked the front door and entered the house when suddenly her mouth was covered with a gloved hand, and then Muriel's head almost split from a strong blow. As it turned out, there were several blows to the head and neck, but the elderly hostess of the house passed out immediately and no longer felt how she was being beaten with something heavy. She regained consciousness when the criminal began to take off her stockings and underwear. Muriel tried to scream and call for help, but the attacker hit her again, after which he still took off her stockings, wrapped them around her neck, finishing his dirty work. The perpetrator walked around the house, looking at what to profit from, but took only $100 from his victim's handbag. With a gesture that was already familiar, he neatly put his shoes and handbag next to the body and quietly left the house. Neighbor Maggie, knowing Muriel's unbreakable stubbornness, visited her every day. The woman even had spare keys to the house. Maggie immediately sensed something was wrong when she noticed an untouched lunch on the porch that was delivered daily to the elderly lady. It was already difficult for her to do housework because of her age. Using the spare key, neighbor Maggie entered the house and saw a picture that she had more than once described to Muriel, trying to protect her from leaving the house. This is exactly what the crime scene looked like, described in the news. The mistress of the house was lying lifelessly face down in a pool of her own blood, and her shoes were standing next to her. Maggie, unlike other kind-hearted neighbors, did not touch anything. She went home and called the police. Thanks to her competent actions, the detectives finally had physical evidence left by the criminal. These were bloody footprints on the carpet, and although the traces were not very clear, they could tell a lot about the person who wore such shoes. Part of the carpet with the prints was cut out and sent to the forensic laboratory. The experts were able to completely reconstruct the sole. And what was the surprise of the police officers when they learned that such shoes are not worn by young people? They are usually bought by middle-aged or elderly people. When investigators went around the neighborhood to question possible witnesses, one of the neighbors said that he had seen an unfamiliar, respectable middle-aged man not far from Muriel Falconer's house, but with gray hair. The stranger was dressed in a gray suit with a silvery sheen. By Christmas, the reward for helping to catch the criminal had been increased to $250,000. The police kept secret from the media all the information that had come to light, so that they would not accidentally scare off the perpetrator. Meanwhile, they checked unsolved cases over the past 6 months involving a gray-haired man and indeed came across something interesting. One of the police reports mentioned the name of an 85-year-old woman named Margaret Todhunter. She was walking down the street when she was approached by a middle-aged man with gray hair who hit her in the face and snatched her purse. The woman survived, but she had to have 8 stitches as a result of the attack. At the time of the investigation, she was living in the state of Queensland. Detectives flew there specifically to meet with her and ask a few questions. Margaret was able to give them a fairly accurate description of the criminal who had attacked her and, presumably, had massacred several other elderly ladies. She said that he was about 50 years old, about 175 m tall. He had completely gray hair, a strong build, broad shoulders, a powerful chest, and a large belly. At that time, he was wearing a white shirt in a business style and cream-colored trousers. Based on the description, experts were able to make a sketch of the suspect. Another unsolved case that interested detectives involved 82-year-old Euphemia Carney, who on August 25, 1989, was returning to her home in a retirement village. A gray-haired man who appeared literally out of nowhere approached her, punched her in the chest, and snatched her purse. The woman managed to notice how he got into a blue car and drove away. After that, Euphemia had to treat the bruises on her chest and a head injury from the fall for a long time. The woman was also able to provide the police with a detailed description of the perpetrator, completely coinciding with Margaret's story. Statements and unsolved cases about the strange behavior of a gray-haired man poured in like a cornucopia. The police had several complaints from patients of a nursing home where a middle-aged man, with hair as white as snow, inappropriately touched elderly ladies, stroked their buttocks, lifted up their nightgowns, and touched their breasts. Now the police had more than enough descriptions of the alleged criminal, but the question of where to look for him was still acute. Meanwhile, on January 11th, 1990, an elderly patient at Greenwich Hospital named Daisy Roberts was attacked again. A man, dressed in work clothes and with a clipboard in his hand, entered the oncology ward of the hospital, where there were 4 elderly patients, including 82-year-old Daisy Roberts, with advanced cancer. The gray-haired man, claiming to be a doctor, put his hands under Daisy's nightgown and touched her in an indecent way. The pensioner panicked and called for help by pressing the nurse call button located above the bed. The stranger managed to run out the door, but the nurse did not get confused and followed where he ran. The strange man got into a car and disappeared, but the hospital employee managed to write down the registration number of his car and reported it to the police. As often happens, the brigade that arrived on the call had nothing to do with the investigation of the attacks of the grandmother exterminator. The hospital staff recognized the escaped man as a local pie seller named John Wayne Glover. When the police went to his home to ask a few questions, this man refused to talk without his lawyer. He promised to come to the police station the next day with a lawyer, but never showed up. Glover's wife reported that he had tried to commit suicide because of the ridiculous accusations against him and was now in the hospital. When 2 officers arrived at the medical facility, the doctor did not allow them to see the patient, referring to his unstable behavior. But he handed the law enforcement officers Glover's suicide note, which said that no more old ladies. The man addressed his wife and said that it all started with Essie. The next day, Glover again refused to answer questions from the police, citing a lawyer, but allowed himself to be photographed. The man admitted that he was indeed at Greenwich Hospital that day, but said nothing more. Daisy Roberts recognized the person posing as a doctor in the photo. The nurse also confirmed that it was he who ran out of the ward of seriously ill women. Because the officers handling Daisy Roberts' case did not immediately link the 2 crimes, Glover's suicide note and photo were handed over to the task force handling the grandma exterminator case only 2 weeks later. He rejected all accusations since the police had no concrete evidence. They decided not to question him about the fatal attacks. Around-the-clock surveillance was set up on Glover in the hope that he himself would make some mistake. John Wayne Glover was born on November 26, 1932 in England, into an ordinary working-class family. His parents divorced, and his mother began to constantly have different men. At the age of 14, he dropped out of school and earned money for living by stealing clothes and bags. Because of this, he began to have problems with the law. To avoid prison, John enlisted in the military but was quickly expelled from there when they learned about the crimes. In 1957, Glover immigrated to Australia and settled in Melbourne. Soon he took up his old ways and was convicted of indecent assaults on women with bodily harm and for theft. In 1968, he met his wife and moved to the Sydney suburb of Mossman, to his wife's parents' home. Glover always had problematic relationships with women older than him. It all started with his mother, who got married more than 5 times, and the rest of the time she met with new admirers. With Essie, John's mother-in-law, the relationship also did not work out from the first meeting. With each new day, the hostility between them only intensified. Glover had to endure Essie's open dislike because he lived in her house. Glover's mother moved to Australia in 1976. She died in 1989. Later, in the same year, John was also diagnosed with breast cancer, and he had a second mastectomy. After that, he began to have problems with potency. John's mother-in-law, Essie, also died. Before the man began to carry out his massacres of single pensioners in the late 80s, he was a volunteer in the Elderly Society and was considered a friendly and trustworthy person. He was married, had 2 daughters, and lived a normal life in Mossman. His wife was an administrator in one of the nursing homes. Lately, Glover worked as a sales representative in a meat pie company.
His working day began early in the morning and ended after noon, so all the crimes were committed during the daytime. For work, the man often went to different suburbs of Sydney, where he committed his attacks. By March 19, 1990, surveillance of Glover had been going on for 6 weeks. On that day, the man called in sick at work. He himself bought a bottle of whiskey and around 10 a.m. headed to the house of his friend, 60-year-old divorced Joan Sinclair. The observers took up positions near the house and waited. Hours passed, but there was no movement in the house. The surveillance team became concerned, and around 6 p.m. received permission to enter the house. The police officers knocked on the front door, but no one answered. Then they walked around the building, looked inside through the glass back door, and saw a hammer lying in a pool of dried blood on the mat. The officers opened the door slightly and saw the mistress's lifeless body. They immediately called the task force. Joan Sinclair's head was smashed in and stockings were tied around her neck. The hammer lying nearby turned out to be the instrument of the crimes committed by Glover earlier. He wrapped it in something like a towel, which changed the nature of the blood splatters. That's why the investigators could not establish what was used to strike the victims' heads. John Glover was found unconscious in a filled bathtub. The man had made another attempt to leave this world. He had swallowed a handful of pills, washing them down with alcohol, and then, just in case, decided to cut his left wrist. His life was saved by the fact that the mixture of whiskey and medicine caused severe vomiting. When he was found, he was barely breathing. The next day in the hospital, when Glover came to his senses, he confessed to the detectives that he had taken the lives of elderly women who resembled his mother-in-law, Essie. As it turned out, John, in addition to everything else, had finally lost interest in women. Therefore, this whole ritual with underwear was nothing more than a spectacle designed to humiliate the dignity of the victims. With the stolen money, he bought drinks for himself and his friends, spent part of the money on slot machines, and just wasted it on all sorts of nonsense. During a search of Glover's house, shoes were found that matched the footprints left at the crime scene in Muriel Falconer's home. The man was charged with taking the life of Joan Sinclair and placed in custody. Then, together with the detectives, Glover went to the crime scenes and told in detail how he had stalked and sent his victims to the next world. On March 28, 1990, 57-year-old John Wayne Glover was officially charged with the deaths of 6 elderly women, as well as a series of attacks. His trial began on November 18, 1991. According to a psychiatrist, Glover had been accumulating hostility and aggression towards his mother since childhood, and then towards his mother-in-law, who felt it and responded with the same dislike, thereby provoking his anger to come out. But Glover held on as best he could. After all, she was his wife's mother. When she died, he had to vent his accumulated aggression on someone else. After the death of Joan Sinclair, the criminal realized that his actions no longer brought him the relief he had experienced at the beginning, and the police would sooner or later find evidence of his involvement in all these deaths. The defense tried to use this explanation for John's actions to mitigate the sentence, but judging by his calmness, he hardly regretted anything. The prosecutor made it clear that all the defendant's actions were planned in advance. He carried gardening gloves in the trunk of his car so as not to leave clues, and a hammer, which he cleaned with acid after each crime. The jury deliberated for several hours before finding him guilty. The judge sentenced John Glover to the maximum term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Despite the verdict, detectives believed that the convicted man could have been involved in a number of other serious crimes. But this is unlikely to ever be known, as John Glover took this secret with him to the grave. On September 10, 2005, he was found dead in his prison cell. It was confirmed that the 72-year-old serial criminal exterminator of grandmothers had hanged himself. On May 12, 1985, the Sayfield family noticed that their neighbors had not left their house for several days. Bob Seafield decided to check to see if they were okay, and as he approached their window, he heard a baby screaming. When the officers arrived and entered the house, they were horrified by what they saw. Catherine Jean Furnish, known to those close to her as Kathy, was born on October 29, 1953, in Kansas City, Missouri, United States. She was the daughter of Jane Furnish and Eugene Furnish, had two sisters, Susan and Patricia, and a brother, Timothy. In the 70s, Catherine found her love at a single softball game when Gary Eastburn saw her and fell madly in love. They began dating almost immediately. In 1975, when the young man was about to enlist in the U.S. Air Force, they decided to get married. After 3 years, on May 21, 1979, the Eastburns had their first child, Kara Sue. Then, on November 17, 1981, Erin Nicole was born. And finally, in 1983, the family grew again with the addition of Jana. Gary was a captain in the Air Force, and that same year he was assigned to Pope Air Force Base as an air traffic control supervisor. The family subsequently settled in Fayetteville, North Carolina. 2 years later, Gary was selected to be an air communications officer at a base near London. Prior to this, he was required to attend a 10-week officer training course at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery. Originally, the Eastburns planned to move to Alabama together while the man attended the training. However, it was later decided that it was better for Katie to stay in Fayetteville with the girls. This allowed them not to face 2 moves in a row, and Kara could continue to attend daycare regularly. It would also help the mother get busy preparing for the upcoming international move. In addition to members of the Eastburn family, this story features Timothy Belly Hennis, a man born February 24, 1950. He grew up in the city of Rochester, Minnesota. In the year 80, Timothy went into the Army. And 5 years later, when the events that are about to be discussed took place, the 27-year-old soldier had the rank of sergeant and was working as a parachute installer. He was married to a woman named Angela, and his first daughter, Christina, had just been born. The Eastburns and Timothy's stories crossed on Tuesday, May 7, 1985, when he responded to an ad Catherine had placed in the local paper, offering to foster Dixie, the family dog. Under the rules of moving to London, they couldn't take the dog with them, and the thought of having to find a new home for her was very hard. But they were confident they could find a loving family who would care for her and make her happy. The publication coincided with a search that Henice's family was conducting. They had a dog who wouldn't accept their newborn baby, and they wanted a dog adapted to socializing with children. That Tuesday, Catherine invited Timothy to her home, and after exchanging pleasantries, he took Dixie to see if she would fit in with his family. By this time, Gary had been at Maxwell Base for 9 weeks. As is customary for spouses accustomed to long separations, due to the captain's business trips, husband and wife maintained regular communication through letters and weekly calls. But on Saturday, May 11th, the day scheduled for such communication, Gary did not receive a call from Catherine. Moreover, all of the man's subsequent attempts to speak with his wife were unsuccessful. The man realized something was wrong and called the Fayetteville Police Department. Officers responded to the call and went to the man's home. But no one answered the door, and they noticed the lights in the house were off. Before leaving, they left a note for the homeowner asking her to contact her husband. On Sunday, May 12th, which was Mother's Day, the Eastburns' neighbors, Sergeant Bob Seafield and his wife, noticed newspapers piled up outside the house. Thinking back over the past few days, they realized that Catherine's car hadn't been touched in days, and the stroller was parked by the back door as usual. Bob decided to investigate, and although no one answered the knocking and ringing of the doorbell, he thought he heard a baby crying coming from behind the door. So he went home and called the Eastburns' nanny, Julie Cherniak, who arrived on the scene very quickly. She looked out the window and saw Jana. She was lying in her crib with her arms outstretched. The woman tried to go into the house to get the baby, but Bob convinced her not to and to wait for the police. The first police officer to arrive on the scene, William Toman, opened the window in the baby's room and handed him to Bob along with a diaper. He asked the neighbor to wait outside while he searched the house, as there was a very strong odor inside and he had to check what was causing it. Once the officer moved on, he discovered the lifeless bodies of Catherine and Erin and decided to call for backup. Upon further inspection, Tara's remains were also discovered. While police cordoned off the scene, Jana was being cared for at the Seafield home. The girl was desperate, crying and covered in feasts. The doctors who treated her determined that she was severely dehydrated and said that her condition was so severe that if she did not get help, she would die. 31-year-old Catherine, whose body was found without pants or underwear with a torn blouse and bra, had multiple stab wounds and had been sexually assaulted. 3-year-old Erin was in her parents' bedroom. She also had stab wounds and blood force trauma to her chest and back. 5-year-old Kara was found in her bed as if she was hiding under a blanket. She also had various injuries to her chest. All 3 victims had their throats slit. Police determined that Jamin had been in her crib for 3 days before neighbors found her. They also concluded that the perpetrator did not take her life because there was no risk that she would recognize him. Experts took samples from both the scene and the victims' bodies. Among the evidence were strands of hair, fingerprints, traces of blood, and seminal fluid. The latter was discovered during the examination of Catherine's body. Experts noted that there was little blood at the scene given the severity of the injuries. However, a luminol test revealed that someone had weeped blood on the walls and in the bathroom. Detective Jack Watts took it upon himself to contact Gary and inform him of what had happened to his family. When the phone rang in the bedroom, the captain thought he would finally hear his wife's voice. But as soon as he was informed that a detective was calling, he prepared for the worst. Picking up the phone, he identified the caller and asked how many were dead. The officer replied that he could not give him that information over the phone, but there had been a tragedy in his family and he should return immediately. That same evening, Gary boarded his plane, not knowing what awaited him. As soon as he arrived in Faithville, he learned that someone had taken the lives of his wife and his 2 daughters. In that moment, the realization that Jana had survived gave him the strength to move on with his life. Gary was extremely depressed when detectives took his statement. He was initially considered a suspect, but it was soon discovered that he had traveled to Alabama weeks before the crime. From the information Gary shared, what caught the investigators' attention the most was the posting of an ad looking for a home for the dog and the visit that Catherine received on the 7th. Gary said that in the letter, his wife informed him that a very kind man had taken the dog in hopes that it would be able to adapt to his family. After taking a statement from the Air Force captain, they took him home to help them determine if any items were missing. Gary reported that Catherine's bank card and a piece of paper with her password were missing. Also missing was an envelope containing approximately $300. While investigators were determining the identity of the assailant, they were approached by Patrick Cohn, 20, who provided information he thought might be of interest. He said that on Friday evening, May 10th, he saw a man leaving the Eastburn home. It was on that day that police believe the tragedy occurred. According to Patrick, around 3:30 Friday morning, while driving home, he saw a white Chevrolet parked in the driveway and a man leaving the house. The witness explained that he was in close proximity to the man and described him in great detail. According to him, he was white, tall, with blonde hair, a wide nose, and a mustache. He also indicated that the man was wearing a black jacket over a white shirt and blue jeans. In addition, he noted that he was holding a trash bag. Investigators asked the young man to help create a sketch of the suspect. Authorities then released a sketch and description of the man. In addition, a call was made for the man who responded to Catherine's ad for the dog to contact police. The notification by the authorities had the expected effect. Timothy Hennis was sitting at home watching the news with his wife when he saw the ad. He was shocked to see that he was the man who not only answered the ad, but also bore a striking resemblance to the man pictured. The sergeant immediately left his home with his wife and daughter and drove his white Chevrolet to the police department where he offered to help in any way he could. Timothy answered all questions for nearly 7 hours without an attorney present and never asked for one. In recounting how his encounter with Catherine on the 7th occurred, he said that he parked his car at his home around 9 p.m. and walked up the driveway holding a leash. According to him, upon knocking on the door, he encountered a woman who invited him in. Continuing his story, the sergeant reported that Catherine told him that she had just put her 3 young daughters to bed and began introducing him to Dixie. Timothy added that he liked the dog but wanted to see if she would get along with his Spitz, so he agreed to take her home with his wife and daughter and keep in touch with her. Investigators determined that the crimes were committed between Thursday evening and early Friday morning. It was on the 10th that newspapers began piling up on the porch of the house. In addition, neighbors had seen her earlier on the 9th. Given this evidence, the officers asked Timothy to describe his actions that evening. He said he drove his wife and daughter to a relative's house and then returned home. The officers handling the case asked the suspect to give hair, blood, and seminal fluid samples, but the results did not link Timothy to the case. He then held a lineup, which was attended by several people with similar physical features. Patrick didn't hesitate to identify him. From that point on, the investigation focused on the sergeant, and detectives began interviewing his neighborhood. Neighbors said they saw him burning things in a barrel near the house and were there for 5 hours, working on the fire. This caught their attention as they had never seen him doing such an activity before. The dry cleaners also reported that the suspect took his jacket to the laundry the day after the crime was committed. Another important piece of information was provided by the owner of the house where the Hennesses lived. He said that Timothy, who owed him $350 in rent, repaid the debt immediately after the incident. After the interrogations, Timothy and Angela thought they would never get to the police again, but they were wrong. After obtaining an arrest warrant, detectives showed up at their home to arrest the sergeant for sexual assault and first-degree murder against Catherine and her 2 daughters. During the investigation, a witness named Lucille Cook came forward and provided information linking the defendant to the use of the victim's debit card. Investigators determined that the card, stolen from the scene, was used at 10:54 p.m. on May 10 and 8:56 a.m. on May 11. According to the woman, she used the ATM just before a tall, blonde-haired man wearing camouflage pants then drove away in a light-colored vehicle. The timing given by the witness coincides with the aforementioned banking transactions. Detectives linked the $300 cash withdrawal to the rent delinquency I mentioned above. Timothy hired a prestigious law firm and was represented by Gerald Beaver and Billy Richardson, who were considered the best attorneys in North Carolina. Prosecutors offered Timothy's defense a plea deal to 2 counts of second-degree murder with a likely sentence of 2 consecutive life sentences. But he refused, saying he would not plead guilty to something he did not commit. The defense sought to discredit the testimony of one of the prosecution's key witnesses. To do so, they recreated the moment Patrick crossed paths with a man he identified as Timothy. They went to the Eastburn house at the same time to ensure the same lighting and fog conditions. The person playing the role of witness did not see the suspect during the reconstruction. The defense got an additional element during the scene examination. A neighbor approached them and said that on the night of the crime, he saw a van parked outside the family's home and saw a white male with a short haircut who was with friends. A second reconstruction was subsequently conducted with Patrick, who concluded that he may have been mistaken in his identification. The defense attorneys then turned to a prosecution witness, Lucille, a woman who claimed to have seen the suspect at the ATM. During questioning, she changed her story and stated that she had not seen anyone that day. The first trial against Timothy began in 1986, about 12 months after the triple murders. The prosecution built its case on circumstantial evidence without any physical evidence linking the sergeant to the murders. One hypothesis was that Catherine had rejected Timothy's offer of intimacy, in response to which he sexually assaulted her and then decided to end her life and the lives of her daughters so they would not recognize him. During the trial, the prosecutor told the jury that what happened at the Eastburn home was utter madness and could be considered one of the most tragic events that had occurred in the country up to that point. His words were accompanied by a display of dozens of gruesome crime scene photos. Patrick was the main witness called by the prosecution in front of the jury. He identified the defendant as the man he saw leaving the Eastburn home in the early morning hours of May 10, 1985. On July 4, 1986, after 10 hours of deliberation, a jury found Timothy guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree sexual assault. 4 days later, on July 8th, he was sentenced to death and transferred to death row at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. But this was only the end of the first chapter in a long trial, and Timothy's defense remained determined to prove his innocence. In 1988, his attorneys appealed to the North Carolina Supreme Court, citing inconsistencies in the investigation, false testimony, suppression of evidence, and improper display of graphic material that influenced the jury's guilty verdict. As a result, the judges ruled in favor of Timothy, overturning the previous trial and starting a new one that began in April 1989. The defense focused on discrediting Patrick, arguing that his testimony during the first trial was inaccurate. In this case, new witnesses came forward on Timothy's side, including a newspaper delivery woman who testified that on the day of the accident at 1:45 a.m., she saw a long-haired man driving a light-colored van in front of the Eastburns' home. In the same vein, the defense called as a witness a tall, blonde-haired teenager named John Ralpau, who said that he regularly walked near the Eastburn home late at night and admitted that he passed there around 3 a.m. on May 10, 1985. He also indicated that he used to wear a cap and had a black jacket similar to the one the suspect was wearing. This testimony allowed the defense to argue that Patrick could have seen John on that fateful day and raised reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury as to Timothy's guilt. The defense also pointed out that the shoe prints found outside the Eastbourne home were 3 sizes smaller than those worn by the defendant. It was also pointed out that the blood sample taken from the towel did not match the defendant's blood sample. Further evidence was an anonymous letter processed by the post office on the same day of the conviction. The letter apologized to Timothy and accepted responsibility for the crimes committed. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and after 2 days of deliberation, the jury voted in favor of the defendant, who was acquitted of all charges. Timothy walked out of the courtroom a free man. He re-enlisted in the Army, and in 1998 the man moved with his wife and children to Fort Lewis, Washington. After the first trial, Gary moved on with his life because he had Janet to take care of. Although he canceled a move to London after the tragic deaths of his wife and 2 daughters, he decided in 1988 that it was time for a change of scenery. He was in England when he was informed that he had to return to the United States for a retrial. After that trial ended, he traveled back to England where he fell in love and married an Air Force nurse. In 1998, Gary returned to his homeland and settled in a town 20 kilometers from Fort Lewis. In 2005, the Eastbourne family murder was presented as an unsolved case at a seminar for detectives on advanced criminal intelligence techniques. There, Larry Troder, a homicide detective from Cumberland County, heard that seminal fluid samples had been taken at the time, which at the time yielded no matches. However, given advances in DNA analysis, further testing may have led to an identification of the perpetrator. Larry then learned that the sheriff's office was storing these samples and retrieved them. He sent the samples to the State Bureau of Investigation lab, and a year later, the results came back. Along with the results came the answer everyone was waiting for.
The DNA profile matched that of Timothy Belly Hennis. What's more, according to the forensic scientist who conducted the study, the sample was 1 billion times more likely to be Timothy's than any other North Carolina resident. Larry shared this find with District Attorney Robert Battle, who in turn contacted Gary. They always had the right person and finally had a way to prove it. The DA decided to turn the case over to the legal team at Fort Bragg, who presented the case file to the military base commander general. The commander demanded that Timothy be called to active duty so that he could be charged with 3 counts of murder and court-martialed. On September 26, 2006, a military lawyer, a Fort Bragg CID officer, and 2 police officers went to Timothy's home and handed him a letter ordering him to report to base within 30 days. The man reported for duty and, despite the charges against him, began working part-time in the office, receiving pay and benefits. Timothy's court-martial took place on March 17, 2010, 21 years after his acquittal. It was presided over by Colonel Patrick Parrish. One of the prosecutors noted that the only difference between the previous trials and the court-martial was the new DNA evidence. Among the prosecution's evidence were photographs taken at the scene of the crime, as well as a series of photos provided by Gary showing his daughters and his smiling wife. After a 3-week trial, the defendant was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to death on April 15, 2010. Timothy Hennis was dishonorably discharged from the Army and confined to the disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Upon learning of the sentence, Gary stated that he did not believe Timothy's days were numbered, as the last execution in the Army took place in 1961